In this video, I'm going to show you how to use case statements to add conditional logic to your SQL queries. Case statements operate very similar to if-then-else statements in other programming languages. We're going to begin the statement with the word case, followed by when, and then some condition, then followed by some output. And we can repeat this when-then logic multiple times, followed by an else, which handles any conditions that aren't covered by our when logic, and then an end keyword that effectively terminates that conditional logic and renders our column. Another interesting thing to note about case statements is that you can nest them inside of each other. So you can have a case statement inside of a case statement inside of a case statement. The task for this particular video is that we want to classify each film in our inventory based on its length as either less than 1 hour, 1 to 2 hours, 2 to 3 hours, or over 3 hours. Let's begin. First, we'll start with a basic query against the film table. We'll select from film, and then in our select clause, we'll ask for film ID, title, length, rating, and then run the query. Now our goal here is to categorize each movie into groups based on whether they are less than an hour long, 1 to 2 hours long, 2 to 3 hours long, or more than 3 hours long. To do this, we'll go down another line below rating, and then we'll start our first case statement by typing the word case. Then we'll come down a line, indent, and start our first when statement. We'll say when length is between 0 and 59, then less than 1 hour. Then go down another line and say when length is between 60 and 119, then 1 to 2 hours. Then we'll go down to the next line and say when length between 120 and 179, then 2 to 3 hours. Finally, we'll wrap this up with an else that says if it's not any of these conditions, then over 3 hours. Then we'll terminate the case statement with the keyword end, and then we'll alias it as film length category. Let's go to the bottom below our from clause and say order by length. Clean up our query and then run it. Now, if we scroll through the results, we should see everything less than 60 minutes equating to less than 1 hour. Then we have our 1 to 2 hour films. We have a lot of those. And then those eventually give way to our 2 to 3 hour films right here. Eventually we'll come upon our films that are over 3 hours in length. So this is a basic example of a case when statement. Now, suppose we want to take the output of our case when statement, but we want to group everything together and get a count of how many films fall into each category. Well, we can do that. Let's first of all go back and let's put our case statement at the top of our select. Then let's go below our film clause and add a group by clause in which we will say group by, and then we're just going to take our case statement all the way from case through end. We're going to copy it and we're going to paste it into our group by. Let's go back to our select clause, go one line below our case statement, and start a new line in which we'll say comma, count film ID as count of films, and then we will say order by count of films in descending order, and then run it, and we get a count of the number of films that fall into each of these categories. We can't specify an alias in the group by clause, so we have to just take everything else about our case statement and paste it in there in order to successfully group the output into what you see here. There's a second way to write case statements that I'll also show you in this video. In this case, the wording is just slightly different, although it's actually a little bit easier if you think about it. What we'll do is we'll start a new line, and then we'll say case, and then we're going to put in the name of a column that we want to evaluate. In this case, we'll put in rating. Our goal here is to interpret each of our film ratings into their United States long-form descriptions. So we'll say case rating, then come down a line, and then we'll start our first when operator. We'll say when G, then general audiences. When PG, then parental guidance suggested. When PG-13, then parents strongly cautioned. When R, then restricted when NC 17, then adults only. Then we'll say else unknown end as rating description. All right, then we'll change our order by to say order by rating and run the query. Now we should see G as general audiences, PG as parental guidance suggested, PG-13 as parents strongly cautioned, R as restricted, and NC-17 as adults only. Unfortunately, we don't have any unknowns. We managed to successfully categorize each of our ratings on the first attempt. So now, let's take the same thing that we did with our previous example and let's try to group our films and figure out how many films are in each rating category. So we will take everything in our select clause before the case statement and get rid of it. We'll go below our from clause and add a group by. And we'll take our case statement, everything from case through end, we'll paste it in the group by. Take our rating description and add it to the order by clause, and then we'll go back to our select clause and say count film ID as count of films. All right, run the query, and we see we have 210 adults only films, which seems like an awful lot, and then we have 178 general audiences, 194 PG, 223 PG-13, and 195 R-rated movies. If you want, you can also add those ratings in here as well by just going into select clause, drop the case statement down a line, and then put rating, and then in the group by clause, do the same thing. Drop the case down a line, and then say group by rating, and then case. Now, if you run it, you will get not only the rating codes, but also the rating descriptions and the number of films in each rating. Case statements are a really great way to take conditional logic and add it to your SQL as a way to interpret the data and add new and interesting categorizations.